The boardroom was filled with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of expensive glassware, and the faint rustle of papers. It was supposed to be a simple quarterly review meeting, but when the double doors opened, silence fell like a sudden storm. Alexander Hart, one of the city's most respected millionaires and CEO of a rising empire, walked in, not with his usual calm, confident stride, but with the arrogance of a man who believed the world revolved around his charm. And at his side, clinging to his arm like a prized possession, was not his wife of 5 years, Grace, but a young woman in a red dress whose laughter echoed too loud, too careless, too cruel. The whispers spread through the room like fire. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed for Grace. Others smirked, feeding off the scandal. But it was Grace herself, seated at the end of the long glass table, who stood frozen, her hands instinctively covering the small swell of her stomach. She had come to surprise her husband with the ultrasound results of their first child, the moment she had long prayed for after years of heartbreak and disappointment. Instead, she was the one who received the cruelest surprise of all. Her husband parading his mistress before the entire office as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. The papers slipped from Grace's trembling fingers, scattering across the polished floor. She staggered backward, her lips parting in disbelief, and the room blurred around her. The shock, the betrayal, the humiliation all struck her at once, and before anyone could react, Grace collapsed onto the ground, her body giving way under the weight of broken trust and the life she carried inside her. And in that instant, the laughter of the mistress, the arrogance of Alexander, the whispers of the employees, everything shattered. The sound of Grace's body hitting the floor cut deeper than any silence. Alexander's face drained of color, his heart slamming against his ribs as reality came crashing down. His wife, his child, his entire world, falling apart before his eyes because of his selfish pride. Before I continue, let me pause here, dear viewers. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the strength of true love, please don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel, Stories Collection. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful and emotional stories like this one to life. Now, let's return to Grace's journey. Grace was rushed to the hospital, unconscious, her hand still protectively resting on her stomach even as the doctors wheeled her through the emergency doors. Alexander followed, his mind spinning in chaos, his heart suffocating under guilt. For the first time in his life, the weight of his decisions bore down on him, heavier than any business deal, any empire he had built. The image of Grace's face, so pale, so fragile, would not leave him. He tried to hold her hand, but the nurses pushed him aside, their disapproving glares silently condemning him. As hours passed in the waiting room, Alexander sat hunched over, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie discarded, his face buried in his hands. His mistress had disappeared the moment the scandal became inconvenient, leaving him alone with his shame. And in that loneliness, he saw himself clearly for the first time, not as a powerful CEO, not as the man who could buy anything he wanted, but as a husband who had betrayed the only woman who ever truly loved him. Grace woke hours later, her body weak but her spirit burning with silent pain. She turned her head away when she saw Alexander, tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't speak a word, but her silence was louder than any scream. Alexander tried to explain, to apologize, but what words could ever undo the moment he had shattered her heart in front of the world? She closed her eyes, shutting him out, and for the first time, he felt what it was like to be invisible to her, to be on the other side of betrayal. Days turned into weeks. Grace refused to see him, speaking only with her doctors and her family. She carried her pregnancy with quiet strength, shielding her unborn child from the toxicity of the man she once thought would protect them. Alexander, desperate to prove he had changed, began to transform his life. He cut ties with the mistress, distanced himself from the shallow social circles he once gloried in, and started showing up at the hospital, not demanding forgiveness but waiting. Waiting in the hallways, waiting for a chance to be seen again, not as a millionaire but as a man who regretted every wrong step. The empire he built began to crumble without his full attention, but he didn't care. All that mattered now was Grace and their child. He sent letters through her family, not pleading, but promising, that he would be there, that he would fight to be worthy, that he would rebuild her trust brick by fragile brick. Grace read them in silence, her tears staining the ink, her heart torn between the love she once held for him and the pain that still throbbed with every beat. When the day finally came, and Grace went into labor, Alexander was still outside, pacing in fear and prayer. Hours of pain and screams filled the air, and then, the cry of new life, fragile and beautiful. Grace held their daughter, her eyes filled with tears of both joy and sorrow. And when Alexander stepped inside, trembling like a man stripped of all power, Grace allowed him one small mercy, to hold his child. His hands shook as he cradled the tiny bundle, his tears falling freely, whispering apologies his daughter could not yet understand. In that moment, he knew forgiveness was not his to claim, but only to earn. Grace didn't speak, but she didn't turn him away either. And sometimes, silence is not rejection, but the fragile beginning of hope. From that day, Alexander lived differently. He no longer flaunted wealth or power. He devoted himself to Grace and their daughter, proving through actions, not words, that he was willing to change. And slowly, very slowly, Grace began to see glimpses of the man she once fell in love with, not the millionaire, not the arrogant CEO, but the man who held their daughter like she was the world, the man who finally understood that love, once betrayed, is not easily won back, but is worth fighting for every single day. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. And if you've ever believed in the power of forgiveness, the strength of love, or the beauty of second chances, leave a comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts. Special request: please comment with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Grace's days of recovery were long and heavy with silence. The hospital room was filled with flowers from people who admired her strength, but not one of those bouquets softened the heaviness in her chest. She often sat near the window, holding her newborn daughter close, her eyes staring out at the skyline, where the lights of Alexander's empire shone like hollow jewels. The city saw him as powerful, admired, even envied. But Grace knew the truth, that power without love, wealth without loyalty, meant nothing. She whispered promises into her daughter's tiny ear, vows that she would protect her with every breath, even if it meant walking away from the man who had broken her heart. Alexander, however, was a man consumed by torment. Each night he returned to the empty penthouse, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoing only with loneliness. The red dress his mistress once wore, the parties that once excited him, all of it now felt like poison. He avoided the reflection in his marble bathroom mirror because the face staring back was not the man Grace once married, but a stranger who had traded love for lust, loyalty for pride. Sleep never came easily. The sound of Grace's body collapsing haunted him, the image of his unborn child nearly lost because of his arrogance replayed endlessly. He was a man punished by his own conscience. Desperation drove him to Grace's parents' home one evening. The modest house, so different from the glass towers he lived in, felt intimidating not because of its size, but because of the raw truth it carried. Grace's father stood at the door, his eyes stern, his arms folded across his chest. "You don't belong here," his expression seemed to say, though the words never left his lips. Alexander asked only to see Grace, to speak to her for 5 minutes. But the door closed on him with quiet finality, and he walked back into the night, a man rejected but still unwilling to give up. In the weeks that followed, Alexander changed not only his habits but also his heart. He pulled out of shallow deals that demanded his time but offered nothing for his soul. He attended charity events he once ignored, not for appearances, but to give quietly, anonymously. He began funding programs for single mothers and struggling families, perhaps as a way of seeking redemption through the lives of others, perhaps as a way of understanding the quiet courage Grace carried in her heart. Slowly, news spread, not of scandals, but of a man rebuilding himself. Employees at his company noticed a gentler tone, a humility in his leadership. He wasn't the same Alexander who once walked into the boardroom with a mistress on his arm. Grace noticed too. Though she kept her distance, news of his actions reached her. At first, she dismissed them as mere attempts to win her back, but when her sister showed her one of his anonymous donations that kept a struggling mother's lights on for another month, something inside her shifted. Maybe he truly was trying. Maybe the man she had loved still existed beneath the mistakes. Still, she remained guarded. Trust, once shattered, was fragile glass. It could not simply be glued back without leaving cracks. The turning point came one stormy night, when Grace rushed her daughter to the hospital with a fever that wouldn't break. She sat by the crib in the pediatric ward, her heart pounding in fear, when Alexander appeared, soaked from the rain, his face etched with worry. He had been following updates from her family, silently protecting from afar. When he saw his daughter's tiny body hooked to wires, tears streamed down his face, raw and unrestrained. He didn't try to speak to Grace, he simply knelt beside the crib and prayed aloud, his voice trembling, begging for the child's healing. Grace watched him, and for the first time in months, she saw no arrogance, no performance, only a father's desperate love. Something inside her cracked open. The walls she had built began to crumble, not all at once, but slowly, like ice melting under sunlight. She reached out, not for him, but for their daughter, and whispered, "She needs both of us strong." Alexander looked up, his eyes red, and nodded, understanding the gift she had just given him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a second chance to fight for it. From that night forward, they began walking a fragile path together, not as husband and wife restored, but as parents bound by love for their child. Alexander showed up for every doctor's appointment, every late-night feeding, every tear and every laugh. He no longer asked for Grace's forgiveness with words, he let his actions speak. And though her heart was cautious, Grace began to see the man she once dreamed of growing old with, not as flawless but as someone willing to be broken and rebuilt. Sometimes love doesn't return in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it comes back slowly, in small moments, like a father holding his child's hand, a husband washing dishes in a quiet kitchen, or a man who once lost everything learning to treasure the simple, sacred gift of family.